Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode. We're going to look closely at the life of someone I'm sure you've heard of, but unless you've specifically sought out information about him, you probably don't know the details of his life. We're going to look at George Custer. Most people think of his last stand at Little Bighorn. Many people think he had a foolish or even needless death. Those who know a little bit more about him might see him as a Civil War era boy general. At 23 years old, he was the youngest general officer to that point in American history. From Gettysburg to Appomattox, Custer led every charge, as Abraham Lincoln said, with a whoop and a shout. Or maybe people know about Custer's fight with the Cheyenne on the Washita River, which some called a significant battlefield victory, while others saw a senseless massacre. Well, in today's episode, we're going to be looking closer at the life of George Custer, whether his death was a tragedy that ended short what could have been a remarkable military career, or his downfall was due to his own arrogance. Today's episode is for Joshua Reddick, a member of Knowlton's Rangers, who wanted me to look a little bit closer at the life of George Custer. We mentioned Custer in the series that James Early and I did on key battles in the Civil War, but we were only able to touch a little bit on what he did. And in our epilogue episode, we looked at the where are they now? Well, not necessarily where are they now, but what happened to them after the war concluded. And we mentioned Little Bighorn, and that was it. But really, his life was fascinating, and I think it worth looking more closely on his life. I also talked with author Harry Crocker several months ago, who wrote a fictional account on what would happen if Custer had not died at Little Bighorn. And we do get a little bit into his life and why his bad reputation could be unfair. But let's get more into the factual account and see what happens there. Also, I should mention that if you want to read more about his life, a great book to dive into is called The Real Custer by James S. Robbins. The subtitle is From Boy General to Tragic Hero. So this account, I think, takes a more sympathetic look at his life, and you can keep that in mind if you want to check it out. And there's plenty of disagreement about his life and his legacy. All right, let's jump in. Custer has been talked about, written about, debated, loved, and hate him. Those who take a more dim look on his life think that his life symbolizes tragedy, recklessness, and disaster. But those who take a more sympathetic look on his life think that he represents one of the finest representations of antebellum American chivalry. Like many historical figures, the real person is somewhere between the two, and more complex and interesting than a one-dimensional caricature would be. Custer, even in his own day, was polarizing, and he had strong supporters and detractors. Biographers had to deal with this duality from the start. Frederick Whitaker's embellished account of Custer's life came the year after George died, but even Whitaker thought it was necessary to address the Custer legend that had grown up around him during his lifetime. He wrote, "The popular idea of Custer as a soldier is that of a brave, reckless, dashing trooper, always ready to charge any odds, without knowing or caring what was the strength of his enemy and trusting to luck to get out of his scrapes." But he argued that the real Custer was a remarkably quiet, thoughtful man when any work was on hand, one who never became flurried and excited in the hottest battle. He also claimed Custer had never been caught by surprise, which wasn't true, and was equal to any emergency of whatever kind, which may have been true until it wasn't at the end of his life. As for trusting to luck, throughout the Army, the experience Custer's luck meant having the good fortune to get out of trouble until it meant that you couldn't. Journalist and Civil War veteran George Edward Pound wrote, "Custer's luck will no longer be so much envied by his brother soldiers." He wrote that 4 months after Little Bighorn. But Pound admired Custer and said he would not have so praised his luck had he not confided more in his courage, and his fortune was not in the stars but in his own soul, that born of a cavalryman that flowered into exploits. Well, in his lifetime, Custer attracted comment wherever he went. He was talked about, but that's because he gave people something worth talking about. He cultivated an eccentric image, but he was more than simply the 19th century equivalent of tabloid fodder. Custer was physically brave and morally courageous. As his bugler Joseph Rott said, he was always in the fight, no matter where it was. As a junior officer, he went out of his way to place himself in danger. As a commanding officer, he led from the front. To paraphrase Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who fought in Vietnam, the only thing he had in the Idrong Valley that Custer didn't at Little Bighorn was air support. Custer's been portrayed frequently in movies and television, in characters from the heroic to the absurd. He was a well-meaning fool in 2009's Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, who lamented, "I will always be famous for my biggest failure." Richard Mulligan played him as a volatile, arrogant clown in Little Big Man in 1970. Ronald Reagan, a self-described Custer buff, played him in the historically challenged 1940 feature Santa Fe Trail. Reagan said, "His image has been blurred and distorted over time, but in truth he was a brilliant officer and not at all the boastful show-off his detractors would have us believe." Errol Flynn's interpretation of Custer in They Died with Their Boots On in 1941 also took some liberties with history, but it was a popular and critical success. Flynn captured Custer's boyish spirit and charm, and the movie shaped perceptions of Custer for decades. Part of the continuing fascination with Custer stems from his contradictions. He was a good friend who inspired loyalty, but his outsized personality could provoke bitter rivalries. He was a devoted husband whose natural flirtatiousness opened up rumors of infidelity. He didn't go to church, but he prayed before every battle. He was a lifelong Democrat who had to downplay his political views to placate radical Republicans in the North. He was a scourge of the Confederacy, but a close friend to many rebels, and even showed up in Union uniform to a wedding of his Confederate friend during the Civil War. He was Sitting Bull's foe, but said if he had been born an Indian, he also would have abandoned the reservation to free ride on the plains. Custer lives strongest in the American cultural memory as an Indian fighter, and while he criticized aspects of Native American culture, he also found much to admire. He took to the field against bands the government deemed hostile, but he said there was nothing better than living side by side with tribes at peace. He studied and attempted to understand the people of the plains, and was sometimes compared to them. The officer with the heart of an Indian, that, as he was described, who charged like a Sioux chieftain. Custer was willing to smoke the peace pipe as he was prepared to fight. But as a soldier, he followed orders, and his primary concern was achieving victory. He killed Indians in battle, just as he killed Confederates in the Civil War, and in greater numbers. He burned Indian lodges, just as he scoured the Shenandoah Valley. And Custer also happened to serve with some of the most important figures of the Civil War. His superiors were Generals George McClellan, Alfred Pleasonton, and Philip Sheridan. These senior officers possessed the insight to understand how to use Custer's talents, how much initiative to let him have, and what risks he could reasonably take, and he could take quite a few. The Custer they knew was a gifted tactician who had the ability to sum up the shifting situation he faced and use forces at his disposal swiftly and effectively. They set the stage for him and did his part to win battles. Well, Custer's personality showed itself pretty quickly when he was a student at West Point. When he was a cadet, his behavior showed us that he believed rules were made to be broken. He was a merry prankster of the Corps of Cadets, a rogue who did things his way. He was witty, charismatic, and popular. There were others like him who courted the retribution of authorities, but Custer had an uncanny ability to get himself out of trouble as much as he got into it. He racked up demerits, but stayed just below the line that brought expulsion. He submitted to periodic punishments as a price of playing the game. Whether it was due to his charm, good fortune, or intuition, he managed to live an exuberant life of a cadet and still graduate, even though he was at the bottom of his class, and face a court-martial the day before graduation. Custer's West Point exploits give insight into his combat leadership. He was a creative thinker and dynamic problem solver. He volunteered for dangerous wartime scouting missions and led dramatic charges against difficult odds. He could have done better at West Point if he had followed more rules and studied more lessons and avoided demerits, but then he wouldn't have had the personality that made him Custer. Custer came from a humble background and got ahead on ability and courage. He was a risk-taker who traded on his accomplishments, not his background or birth. He was at his best in situations where quick decisions were needed. And he also had luck, again, at least until it ran out, when he arrived on the national scene at the right time. He was a natural warfighter thrust into the greatest conflict of the 19th century. He wound up in situations where he could give full expression to his instinctive genius for war and was rewarded with rank, fame, and influence. But when the Civil War ended, Custer had trouble adapting to the new order. He had fewer battles to fight, fewer opportunities to give expression to his spirit, and he had to reinvent himself while staying true to his character. John M. Bulkley recalled Custer as the genial, warm-hearted friend from his childhood, and wrote that under the garb of the soldier and the sometimes austere exterior, there beat the warmest of hearts and existed the most affectionate of natures. Bulkley believed that Custer he knew would long be remembered. He said, "The gallant bravery, the spirit, and the patriotism of Custer commanded him to public favor, and it is not in the heart of the American people soon to forget those whose blood has been shed in their name." So Custer hasn't been forgotten. He may, though, be misremembered depending on which account you're reading. So that's a general overview of his life. Let's get into more detail of his exploits during the Civil War. Custer was known as Armstrong or Oddie to his friends. And interestingly enough, his friends were mostly Southerners. He liked to read Southern chivalric romances, and his family was ardently Democratic and loathed abolitionists. When Custer opted to fight for the Union, a lot of it had to do to geography. He'd been born in and sent to West Point from Ohio and spent half his boyhood in Michigan. He fought not to eradicate the Southern way of life. He mostly admired it. And early in the war, he even attended, as best man, the wedding of a paroled Southern officer at a Virginia plantation. Then he hung around for nearly a fortnight courting one of the belles, until he realized that General McClellan was evacuating from the peninsula. And as James Early and I discussed in our Civil War series, at the beginning of the Civil War, the motivations for the North were largely not to end slavery. It was to hold the Union together. The animating force of emancipation didn't really become strong for the Union cause until near the end of the Civil War, and still there were many on the North that didn't care for this, so there were a lot of mixed feelings going around on both sides. And this includes Custer. He didn't fight for the Union because he disagreed with states' rights, nor did he fight because he wanted to abolish slavery. During the war, he adopted one runaway slave as a servant. He fought for the Union largely because of the oath of allegiance to the United States he had taken at West Point. And this comes from his chivalric notions of undying loyalty to his friends, to his family, to his benefactors, and to always uphold an oath. When he earned some minor distinction at the Battle of First Manassas in the Civil War, or the Battle of First Bull Run, Custer rode into Washington, D.C. to introduce himself to Congressman John A. Bingham, a Republican, who had sponsored his nomination to the United States Military Academy. He thought it the right thing to do. The congressman remembered the encounter. Beautiful as Absalom, with his yellow curls, he was out of breath, or had lost it in embarrassment, and he spoke with hesitation. "Mr. Bingham, I have been in my first battle. I tried hard to do my best. I felt I ought to report to you, for it's through you I got to West Point. I took his hand. "I know you're my boy Custer." Well, Custer was born a blacksmith's son. He didn't have any social distinction, but he grew up in a large family where politics was meat and drink. He was a charismatic figure and liked to flirt, but not known for his affairs, unlike other officers of the time. And he also liked to drink, though he later took a pledge, and like J.E.B. Stuart, the Confederate general, once on the wagon, he never fell off. He was one of the most popular cadets at West Point because he was one of the most irresponsible, the king of demerits, and once he asked a Spanish professor how to say class dismissed, and when the poor sap said it, he let his fellow cadets out of the room. Unlike other cadets who found West Point a place of drudgery, Custer loved it, even though he violated the rules constantly. After his first year at the Point, he wrote, "I would not leave this place for any amount of money, because I would rather have a good education and no money than to have a fortune and be ignorant." I mentioned earlier that Custer had a court-martial right at the date of graduation, and that was because he was refereeing a fight between two cadets. Custer himself wasn't much of a brawler. He used his wit to get out of most scrapes, and he saved his battles for the battlefield. Custer went straight from West Point to the front, serving at First Manassas and then on to the peninsula. Custer was brave, he was a good scout, and considered a dispensable one, as he was sent up in balloons for aerial reconnaissance. This was something used in the Civil War, and you were in constant danger of being shot out of the sky. He led to the initiative in action, and he took pride in never confessing to fatigue or hunger, all of which endeared him to his superior officers. General McClellan, after a successful reconnaissance, turned to the young lieutenant and said, "Do you know you're just the young man I've been looking for, Mr. Custer? How would you like to come onto my staff?" Then Custer was given a brevet rank of captain. McClellan respected Custer, and he said of him, "In these days, Custer was simply a reckless, gallant boy, undeterred by fatigue, unconscious of fear, but his head always clear in danger, and he always brought me clear and intelligible reports of what he saw when under the heaviest fire. I became much attached to him." After Lincoln dismissed McClellan, Custer joined the staff of General Alfred Pleasonton, and it was Pleasonton who really sent Custer's star soaring higher.